opportunity for an open dialogue with our friends and partners among the global South and East states. This year, Russian presidency invited to this meeting leaders from the CIS countries and delegations from many Asian states, African states, Latin American states, and heads of the executive bodies of a number of international multilateral organizations. We exchanged opinions on the key international issues, putting a special emphasis on the exacerbation of the situation in the Middle East. We also discussed the prospects of cooperation between the BRICS countries and the global South and East countries in the interest of the sustainable development. And the most important thing, that all the events, all the meetings that I've just mentioned were held in a traditionally business-like and open key, with the atmosphere of mutual understanding. And this constructive approach to the joint work allowed us over these 3 days to discuss in detail the great number of various matters. At the summit, we approved the Kazan Declaration of BRICS that summed up the discussions that we had. And I believe that we have a conceptual document with positive agenda that is looking into the future. And the main thing is that it reaffirms the willingness of all our states to build more democratic, inclusive, and multipolar world order that is based on international law and UN Charter. It stipulates the determination to stand against the practice of legitimate sanctions, attempts to undermine traditional moral values. The BRICS states aim to deepen partnership in finance. We are going to continue to tighten up the interbank communication and establish independent mechanisms of mutual settlements in national currencies. And I also would like to note that during the summit, we discussed in detail possible joint efforts for additional impetus to activate investment to ensure consistent growth, economic growth for the BRICS countries and global South and East countries. And we are going to employ new development bank under the guidance of its governor, Madam Rousseff. Russia suggested to extend Brazilian chairmanship over this bank and extend the term of its governor, Madam Rousseff. This year, Brazil is going to preside over G20. Next year, it would take over as president of the BRICS organization, and I'm not going to conceal it. We know what the situation is around Russia, and we do not want to move all the issues, all the problems that we are faced with to the institutions that we are part of. We will resolve all the issues that we are faced with ourselves. We have good prospects of industrial cooperation in energy and logistics, in high technology, and many other key areas. And of course, to cooperate more actively in science and culture and sports, in the youth societies and civic societies. In Kazan, we reaffirmed that BRICS is not a closed format. It is open to everyone who shares the BRICS values, and its members are open to work on looking for the joint solutions without any dictate from the outside or any attempts to impose any narrow approaches from anywhere else. BRICS must heed to the growing demand to this kind of cooperation in the world, and we paid special attention to the problem of the possible BRICS enlargement by establishing a new category, partner states category. Delegation members talked a lot, discussed many things on the sidelines of the forum. There were a lot of bilateral meetings, contacts, and conversations on the margins. And we also our delegation tried to have meetings with the leaders of most of the countries that came to attend this summit. But the summit is over, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to thank all the colleagues who traveled to Kazan once again for their contribution into our joint effort. And I would like to mention, I believe it was a significant contribution Throughout our entire presidency, we feel strong support from our partners. It is important, especially since that our presidency is not over with this summit. We have a number of important joint events after the summit. Next year, Brazil is going to take over as the president of the organization, and we are going to give every support to our Brazilian friends. We are going to continue to coordinate closely with all our BRICS partners in the interest of the further enhancement of cooperation within this organization. And seizing the opportunity, I would like to sincerely thank the leaders of Tatarstan, the leaders of the city of Kazan for comfortable conditions for our joint work. I would like to make my apologies to the citizens of Kazan for facing certain inconvenience because there were a lot of motorcades and some roads were shut down, but I would like to assure you that these difficulties were not in vain. I would like to thank you for creating these conditions for our work. Thank you very much. I would like to apologize in advance. We won't be able to answer your questions for too long because I still have a number of bilateral meetings to attend, 7 of them, I believe, and I cannot make my colleagues, my counterparts, wait. But nevertheless, if you have any questions, please, I'm ready to take them. Channel 1, Russian television, you can start. Don Vernitsky, Channel 1, could you speak a little bit more about the financial cooperation of the BRICS countries? Did you discuss a joint investment platform? And did you speak about the establishment of an alternative payment system? Did you talk about any alternative for the SWIFT system? As for the SWIFT, or any alternatives, we're not creating any alternatives to anything, but nevertheless, it's an important matter, urgent matter, and one of the key problems is the mutual settlement problem, and we are following the path of using national currencies, as is well known. As for the payment system, we already use a Russian system of exchanging financial messages that was established by the Russian Central Bank and other member states, BRICS member states. They also have their systems, and we are going to employ these systems as well, and we are going to continue to develop this kind of cooperation. As for a separate common system, we do not have one yet. I believe that what we have is enough, but we need to make relevant decisions in time, administrative decisions. I mean, we talked about this with my colleagues, and we're going to follow this path.
Next question, row number 2, over there. Can you introduce yourself? Yes, Ilya Izhov, RIA Novosti. Mr. President, this forum in Kazan has been the first BRICS summit, not just as the BRICS 5, but as an association that includes a lot of different countries from all parts of the world. And it continues still, and your colleagues today have said on multiple occasions that they are ready to work with BRICS going forward. You've also worked on the BRICS partner state format. So can you share with us about the work along these lines and what signal this Kazan summit provided for further expansion of the BRICS association? Yes, thank you. Well, like I said, a lot of countries are interested, 35 in total, interested in participating in the BRICS format, and we talked about that in Kazan, and we've agreed with our partners that when we look at further expansion, we will first look at creating a list of potential partners, and in fact that list has already been created. Many of the nations that participated in this summit have already provided their applications for further full-fledged participation in the BRICS association. So, as the next step, we will send future BRICS partner states invitations, and if they respond in a positive way, then we will announce who is on the list. eventually. So it wouldn't be right to talk about that conclusively before we receive their positive response. But like I said, most of these countries officially came to us and asked for that. So another question, Izvestia. Mr. President, good afternoon. Viktor Sinyov in Izvestia. So as we know, during your multiple bilateral meetings, you discussed the situation in Ukraine. So what is the situation with the special military operation, and what is the opinion of our partners regarding that subject? Have they spoken about supporting Russia? Well, everyone wants this conflict to end as quickly as possible and through peaceful means, if possible. As you know, China and Brazil stepped up with their own initiative during the UN General Assembly session in New York, and many other BRICS nations support their initiatives, and we are grateful to our partners for caring about this subject and looking for ways to solve it, to resolve it. We see a question from NBC from the United States. Can you give the gentleman the mic, please?
Mr. President, Keir Simmons from NBC News. Mr. President, satellite images are said to show North Korean troops here in Russia. What are they doing here? And wouldn't that be a massive escalation in the Ukraine war? And Mr. President, we are weeks away from the US election. Russia again is accused of interfering, and that you have had private conversations with former President Trump. Have you been speaking with him, and what have you been saying?
Let's address the first part of your question first. Now, the satellite images you spoke of, well, this is a serious allegation. Well, it means that something is happening, but let me tell you one thing. It wasn't the actions of Russia that led to the escalation in Ukraine. It was the coup in Ukraine 2014 that was supported by the United States. And in fact, there are public records about how much the United States spent on organizing that coup. Isn't that an escalation? Wasn't that an escalation? And then, for the next 8 years, they told us lies, saying they wanted to resolve the Ukrainian conflict through peaceful means, through the Minsk agreements. And later, as you have undoubtedly heard yourself, the leaders of Europe told us, straight up told us, that they were lying to us, they were buying time to arm the Ukrainian army, and that is the truth. Now, the next steps towards escalation were by the West, starting to actually arm the Ukrainian regime. And now, what had that led to? That led to a direct participation of NATO army officers participating in the conflict. And we know what happens when UAVs are used, including marine UAVs, and we know who participates in that process, that the officers that are present during those operations. And those are not mercenaries. I'm talking about actual servicemen. And the same goes for high-precision weapons that are being used in Ukraine, such as Storm Shadow, ATACMS, and others. And Ukrainian servicemen cannot do that without satellite imagery, without support, including software support, provided to them by the West. And that can only be done with direct involvement of NATO state servicemen. Now, as for our cooperation and strategic partnership with North Korea, in fact, the agreement on that partnership has been signed recently, and Article 4 specifically, like I said, we always believed, and we continue to believe, that North Korea treats these agreements very seriously, and as to what we do under that Article 4 is up to us. But first, of course, the implementation of Article 4 we must go through with that, and then we will look into how we can go on with that process. But regardless, the Russian army is working successfully, operating successfully along the entirety of the front line, of the line of contact. It works successfully in the Kursk region. Parts of Ukrainian army groups that invaded the Kursk region have been surrounded. We're talking about 2,000 servicemen, soldiers. The Ukrainian army is trying to rescue their soldiers, but so far they haven't been successful. And we are now actually engaging in an operation to liquidate, to eliminate those soldiers. Now, as for your allegations about Donald Trump, this is something that we've heard for years. We've been blamed, and Trump himself has been blamed about some kind of connections, having some kind of connections with Russia. Then they've had investigations, including investigations in the United States, including in the Congress, and everyone now agrees that this is complete nonsense. There has never been any kind of ties or connections between myself and Mr. Trump. As to how Russia-US ties are going to develop going forward after the elections, this is an open question. We are open to, if the United States is open to building good relations with Russia, we will reciprocate. But the choice is up to the new American administration. Next question, Pavel Zarubin. Good evening, I'm Pavel Zarubin, Russia channel. Now, former President Trump also said that during one of the telephone conversations with you, he allegedly threatened you with striking the center of Moscow. Is that true? And if looking on global politics, we see that a lot more often we see these telephone conversations and other secret conversations being made public. How do you treat that new trend? And one more question: do you feel maybe isolated, and do you in any way wish to go back to having conversations with your Western counterparts? Now, first, to answer the first part of your question, well, you can threaten anyone, and when you threaten somebody, you invite him to action. But I don't recall having such a conversation with President Trump. Right now, the election is very hot in the United States, and it's the electoral season, and I would like to invite you not to treat statements like that very seriously. Now, as to what I've heard recently from former President Trump, he spoke about his willingness to do everything to put an end to the Ukraine conflict, and I believe that he's been quite sincere about that. And when we hear statements like that from anyone, we welcome that wholeheartedly. And as for whether I'm feeling isolated or I miss contacts with my counterparts, well, we've been receiving signals from our Western colleagues about potential contacts. We haven't been closing off ourselves, and if someone tells you that I've been refusing contacts with European leaders or other leaders, that is totally lies. We've never refused any contacts with anyone. And if anyone wants to restore relations with Russia, we are always open to that, and we've always been very vocal about it. And as you can see, we go on with normal life. We see our economy growing. Last year, I think our GDP rose by 3.6%. This year is going to be 4% growth. Now, the economy of the European zone is balancing on the edge of recession. So some countries are showing better indicators than others, but they still have their own problems. And we see deficits in a number of areas, in foreign trade. I think that the U.S. national debt is still $34 trillion or something like that, but I don't think that we should keep arguing about that. We need to look into ways of addressing these questions, these matters together, and that is what we're doing as part of BRICS. Now, let's go on. We have some guests from Africa. Thank you so much. My name is Sikan Jormel. I'm a journalist from Cameroon. Mr. President, our team has just returned from the Donbass. And currently we are preparing a documentary to show the reality on the ground in the Donbass, to tell the viewers what it means for Africa. And as we know, Mr. President, that a lot of African countries are currently being we're currently victims of terrorism, of actions aimed at destabilizing Africa and African nations. At the same time, we can see that Russia is helping in the Central African Republic, in the other countries of the Sahel region. And before Russia came, there were other countries present there, and only after Russia arrived, we've been able to stabilize the situation in many of those countries. So my question is, isn't it time for Russia to even deepen and extend its partnership with African countries, not just in military spheres, but maybe in other areas as well? Yes, I completely agree with you. That is the meaning of our work with our BRICS partner states. I think that this is part of the meaning of the entirety of the BRICS platform, and I've just spoke with my colleagues at the closing part of the session today, and we've heard that our experts believe that the economies of countries such as Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, they're going to develop steadily. We're going to see a lot of positive, steady economic development, but there are other regions of the world where we believe that development is going to be extremely rapid, and we're talking about countries of South Asian country and about African countries. So that is why within BRICS we're now looking at the question of establishing a new investment platform that would involve modern digital instruments through which we will create a system that would be without inflation and that would create a new environment for rapid investment into the newly developing markets of the world, and especially in Africa. So why I think that's important, and I think many will agree with me, there are numerous reasons for that. Number one, in those countries we see a very rapid growth of population. In Africa, and yesterday I spoke to India's Prime Minister, I think he said, I think he says the population is growing by 10 million people in India every year. And in Africa too, population is growing very rapidly. And also the level of urbanization is not very high right now, and it is certainly going to go up. So people in Africa are going to increase their rate, their speed of development to catch up with the rest of the world, and we're going to see that. This and a number of other factors is all showing. Also capital is growing. The amount of capital is on the rise. And so all of that shows that we need to focus a lot on Africa too. So we've been talking with my colleagues, and we've been talking about establishing this new work group based on the new development bank of BRICS, so as to create new effective mechanisms for investing into African states and African nations. Everyone will win from this, because not only will be seeing more investment, we'll be seeing more industry created, and there will be returns from that as well for those who are investing into Africa. So what we need right now are the instruments that wouldn't be at risk from some foreign outside actors and outside risks. So I think this is very important, and thank you for asking this very important question. Thank you.
And the final question for today, I would like to give a floor to BBC. Seldomly we see Steve Rosenberg. BBC is the one wearing this hat. I read the BRICS final declaration, and it speaks about the need of the regional and global stability and security and fair world. And the motto of the Russian presidency in BRICS includes this notion of fairness, justice, and security. But how does this correspond with your actions over the last 2.5 years? Russian troops invasion in Ukraine. So where is the justice, stability, and security of Russia as well? Because before the special military operation started, there were no drone attacks on the Russian territories, no shelling of the Russian cities, no foreign troops that would occupy Russian land. And lastly, what do you think about the statement by the British intelligence that now Russia wants to sow chaos in the cities of the UK and Europe? So speaking about the stability, I'd start with the Russian security, because that's what matters the most to me. You were speaking about the drone attacks and so on. Yes, we did not have that, but we had a much worse situation on our hands. And this situation was that when we were making constant suggestions on working on relations with Western countries, we were told to go back to where we belong. We were shown our place. I can speak about this now. So they were saying it politely, but we were always shown where we belonged. And ultimately, that would have led us to the situation when Russia would have become a second-tier state that would only deliver raw materials, exported raw materials, and largely it would have lost its sovereignty. And in this quality, Russia would not only stop to develop, it would cease to exist. Russia cannot exist if it loses its sovereignty. This is the most important thing. And Russia ceasing to exist in this state, to develop its sovereignty in military and economic and state affairs, it means our security and our safety, establishing conditions for its development in the future as a self-sufficient, full-fledged state with those partners, the partners that we have within BRICS, the partners that would respect Russia's independence, our traditions, and we would reciprocate these sentiments. Now, as for the justice in the field of development and security, am I right? Now look, in this regard, I have some ideas. I will try to give you an answer. And here are my thoughts on this regard. So what is fairness and justice in the field of development? Now look, the recent events during the coronavirus pandemic, what happened during that period? I would like to draw your attention to this and attention of all the other media representatives and media outlets. During that period, in the United States, they started printing money, some $6 trillion. And in the European Union, they printed $3-something trillion. And then they used this money to buy everything. First of all, food, but not only food. Medicine, vaccines that they now have to destroy because they are expired now. So they used all this money and they launched the food inflation. They started the overall general inflation across the world. What did the leading global economies do? They abused their exclusive position in the global financial system, both dollar and euro. They printed all this money and then they vacuumed all the most necessary commodities. You consume more than you manufacture and then you earn. Is this fair? We believe it is not. And we want to change this situation. This is what we are doing within BRICS. Now, about the global security. I've already talked about security of Russia. I understand what you mean. But is this fair from security standpoint for years to ignore our constant appeals to our partners not to enlarge NATO to the east, to lie into our faces that they would not enlarge, and then they would violate their obligations not to do that? Is this fair to get in our underbelly into Ukraine and to start building there, not to prepare to build, but to start building military bases? Is this fair to stage a coup d'etat that I've mentioned when I answered the question of your counterpart? Ignoring international law, all the principles and norms of international law in the UN Charter, when they funded a coup d'etat in another country, in Ukraine, in this particular case, pushing the conflict towards the hot phase. Is this fair from the global security point of view? Is this fair to violate the obligations that were assumed under the OSCE when every country signed the document that says that no one country can have security if it affects the security of any other country? We said that, don't do this. It violates our security, it undermines our security, the NATO enlargement. So is this fair? There is nothing fair about this, and we want this situation changed, and we will have it our way. And the latest part was what? The British intelligence statement that you saw chaos on the streets. Thank you for reminding me about this part of your question. Well, this is utter nonsense. You know, what's happening on the streets of certain European cities, it's the outcome of the domestic policies these states pursue. You know, the European economy is on the brink of recession, and the leading economies are factually, in fact, in recession. They have some growth, 0.5%, because of the southern economies, and they do not have any manufacturing facilities, so they have some growth because of tourists. But what do we have to do with this? European countries decided to renounce from our energy. We did not do that, and there is still one pipeline on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, Nord Stream 2. So the German authorities, they only need to press the button and gas will flow. But they do not do that because of the political some political ideas. And now entire industries of the German economy are relocating to the United States because they have better conditions for German factories. And the energy is cheaper there 3 times or 4 times. The tax system is different. So we have nothing to do with this. And it causes certain reaction because the living conditions are decreasing, becoming worse. It is evident. It's according to the data of the European countries themselves. But we have nothing to do with this. You know, it is an attempt to blame someone else in the problems that you're faced with and to shift the blame for the mistakes that they do in the economy or in politics. Now, look at the economy. It's obvious for all the objective experts, because many people in Europe and in many other countries and in the U.S., they were trying to abuse the climate agenda and the global warming agenda. They had no solid reasons from the technological point of view, but they were still shutting down everything that had to do with the nuclear power, shutting down everything that had to do with the coal power generation or other traditional energy sources. But has anyone calculated, no, if Africa could do without this kind of energy? No, but they impose these solutions on the African countries, other developing countries. Oh, yes, maybe from environmental point of view, these technologies, these instruments are efficient, but they do not have the funds to acquire this technology, and they are not given these funds. I believe these are neo-colonial instruments when they force these countries to depend on loans, on this new technology, and then, yes, they issue loans, but on awful conditions. It's not possible to return these loans, to pay out these loans. It's a colonial tool. So first of all, we need to look at the outcome of the European policies in economy, in finance, in domestic policies. And obviously, people are afraid of the exacerbation of the global situation that is caused by escalation in various parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. But we are not the ones who are fanning these flames. Those who are on the other side are doing that, but we are ready to face this escalation, and it's up to you to think if other countries are up to that task. And maybe the final question for the Russian media from Tatarstan. So we have these, how many sectors? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So each sector will get one question. Let's start from the left-hand sector. Let's give the floor to a lady, please. Ariz Mohammed, Sky News Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Mr. President, there are a number of statements that say that Russia might support Iran if Israel attacks. What do you think about these statements? Do they reflect the truth of things? Does Russia consider any assistance at this stage of the escalation in the region? Well, first of all, we are very much concerned with what's happening in the region. And no matter what anyone says, Russia is not interested in exacerbating the conflict. From the strategic point of view, we are not gaining anything from this. We only have more problems on our hands if this happens. As for assisting Iran, yes, we are in contact with Iran, in close contact with Iran, and we believe our role is in establishing conditions to resolve this situation by trying to find a compromise. I believe it is possible because no one in the region, and I have just held conversations on the margins of the forum, no one in the region wants to see this conflict escalated, to see a war, a full-out war in the region.
Yes, please. Kyrgyzstan, right? Right. Mr. President, President Putin, I come from Kyrgyzstan. I worked as a civil rights activist in Kyrgyzstan for 50 years. I represent the peoples of Central Asia and not just Kyrgyzstan. Now, my question, well, first off, I'd like to congratulate on this successful summit. And like the rest of the people of the world, I don't envy you because this is a very responsible position and a lot of responsibility that you carry, but you've been doing it quite successfully. We've seen that at this BRICS summit that 35 nations of the world support your position. We've seen Antonio Guterres come to this summit, and as well as representatives of other international organizations. And in Kazan, we've seen a historic event happen. A multipolar world is rising, and a lot of difficult questions have been discussed here at this summit. We've seen Iran attack Israel, and we are hearing intel that now Israel is preparing an attack against the Iranian oil industry. We've seen, we believe that, our question is, should BRICS countries oppose the actions of the United States and its allies? Shouldn't there be other ships apart from just American air carriers be present in the region? This is the only way, we believe, to stop the conflict between Israel and other nations of the region. Now, we see the West accusing you, President Putin, of refusing to talk to them. But before the Zelensky's summit, you announced your own conditions, and they haven't changed. Is that correct? You still agree to whatever talks. Let's be respectful to others. Thank you. Now, a colleague just moments ago spoke about our readiness to help Iran and provide aid to them. So, speaking about the situation in the Middle East, I'd like to reiterate that once again, I don't think there's a single person on this planet who isn't compassionate and isn't really grieving about what's happening in the region. So many children have died, and we have provided our own assessment of the situation and how to solve it. So only through addressing the key, the foundation of that problem, and we believe that is the source is that the people of Palestine do not have their own state. So, like I said, we need to prevent further exacerbation of this conflict. We need to work with Israel too, and we must admit that Israel did face a terrorist attack in October last year, a grievous attack, and we must be very patient in addressing this situation. we should not, we should condone any response to a terrorist attack that is not proportionate, but we also must strive to reduce the level of confrontation. And the same goes for the situation with Lebanon. So I personally believe we need to work very carefully, and I try to speak about it very carefully, because I think that every word can make the situation more complicated. So I thank you for addressing that. Now, as for our situation with Ukraine, I've commented on that many times. I am thankful to President Erdogan for providing us a platform for having consultations, for having talks, negotiations with the Ukrainian side. That took place in 2022, and at that time there was a draft peace proposal that was in fact almost agreed upon by the Ukrainians, but then they just turned their backs on us. And in fact, there was a later proposal, and an aide of Mr. Erdogan's once called us about a new proposal, and at that time I said, okay, let's look into it. And then just the next day, the representative of the Kyiv regime said, no, we're not talking to you, there are not going to be any negotiations. So at that point I said, just, well, you need to decide for yourselves whether you want that or not. Now I've heard that in the Ukrainian parliaments they've been talking about not peace, but a victory plan, as they call it. Well, we've seen last year their so-called counter-offensive, in which they lost, I think, about 16,000 soldiers. And in just last month, I think in the Kursk region, I think they lost about 26,000. And so much equipment as well. Last year, during their counter-offensive, I think they lost about, I'm not going to lie, but I think it's about 18,000 units of equipment. And now, I think almost 1,000 more, although there are fewer tanks now. But I think that they used fewer tanks now because they have fewer tanks. But before we come up with numbers, we need to look at the situation on the ground and to see what's actually happening there, and then come to a negotiating table and start negotiations. But we see that the leaders of the Kyiv regime do not want negotiations, because to them, if they start a peace negotiation with Russia, that would mean that martial law would have to be switched off, and then they would have to have elections, so they're not prepared to have elections yet. So the ball is in their court now. Good evening. Could you tell us how far are you ready to go to put an end to the war in Ukraine, and other lines that you are not ready to cross? Well, I've just answered that question. We are ready to look at any options, at any kinds of peace negotiations, peace agreements that will be based on the situation on the ground, and that's that. Another question? Thank you so much, Mr. President. I would like to ask a question in Arabic, please. The BRICS group, I think it has overcome a period where it used to be called a platform. Could we call it a centralized unit? Do we have translation?
I beg your pardon.
I believe that at this step, BRICS need to have a kind of a centralized mode of governance so that it could modulate and organize contacts and ties between countries of the world, so that the country that is the president of BRICS during this year, it could be replaced by another country if it could be more effective that way. Now, another matter is that Russia would like to create a mechanism to interact with its partners. Perhaps the central bank or the new development bank could cooperate with similar banks in other regions of the world. So right now we need to create funds that would deal with mutual investment processes. And one more thing, you looked into the issue of adding Saudi Arabia to BRICS. Could you comment on that? Now, question number one about organizing our work within BRICS. Now, certainly this is now a full-fledged organization, you are correct. And you are correct in saying that we need to place a more rigid structure to this organization. This is something that we're going to address moving forward with our colleagues. But every member of this organization is self-sustainable and sincerely wants to maintain this union. So I don't think that there are going to be any faults in the work of this association. I don't want it to become a heavily bureaucratized association. There doesn't have to be a lot of red tape, really. We don't need to have a lot of officials everywhere with salaries and with a system where nobody knows who's responsible for what. But you are correct in saying that there needs to be a more rigid structure. Now, speaking about the bank's situation, well, like I said, we've got the new development bank now. It's a smaller bank, but I think it's already worked with investment that's up to $32 billion. And as to countries such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China and India, I think it's really important for all of us to have a way to safely and responsibly invest into quickly developing markets. I think that's really important, that's critical. And this is why we proposed this new investment platform. Now, as to your question about Saudi Arabia, well, certainly we are having good contacts with our friend, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, and with the King of Saudi Arabia. Representatives of Saudi Arabia took part in this summit in Kazan, and I think we're going to develop these partnership even further.
Yes, please, whatever you have drawn on there, I can see it. I would like to ask a question in Portuguese, if I may, and if it's possible. My name is Bianca. I'm a correspondent with Globo News, El Globo. It is the main TV network in Brazil. And I've got a question about Venezuela. Yesterday, you thanked President Nicolas Maduro for all the efforts, including for his participation in BRICS, but Brazil is against. And I would like to know, where is Russia in all this? Can Venezuela join BRICS against the will of Brazil? And I've got a question about Ukraine as well. You also thanked Brazil and China for their efforts in resolving the political conflict in Ukraine. And I would like to ask you, on a scale from 1 to 10, what are the chances, the way you see it, that this peace plan would be successful, will succeed to resolve the situation in Ukraine? And What is the line that you cannot cross? What is inadmissible for you? As for the chances, it's difficult for me, and I don't think that's the right way to go to put any number on this scale from 1 to 10. I don't want to seem rude, but the fact itself of attempting to start negotiations and then renouncing from these negotiations, I told you that the High Representative of Turkey gave us a call from New York, and before that we had the similar situation when Turkey came up with this initiative regarding the situation in the Black Sea to ensure free navigation and safe navigation and to reach a certain deal on the nuclear power side's safety, and we agreed. And then the head of the Kyiv regime publicly said that no negotiations. And we told our friends from Turkey, well, you are saying about something, and then you refer to them, and then the very next day they refuse to engage in negotiations, and they just shrug shoulders. Well, the partners are difficult. That's why it's difficult to give you any number on this scale. The way the Ukrainian leaders behave is very irrational. Trust me, I know what I'm saying. I'm not going to give you any estimates now. Even that provocation in the Kursk region has to do with an attempt to interfere with the domestic situation, with the elections in the United States. They want to show to the current administration and to the voters of this party, of the ruling party, that their investment in Ukraine were not in vain, no matter what the cost is, even if the cost is the lives of their soldiers. That's what they look at, not in the interests of the Ukrainian people. That's why to give you any assessment on this scale is very difficult, almost impossible. Now, as for Brazil and estimates of Brazil of what's happening in Venezuela, we know about these, about their stance. Our positions in regards to Venezuela do not coincide, and I say this openly because we had a phone conversation with the Brazilian president, and we have very close, I might say, even friendly relations with the president of Brazil. Venezuela is fighting for its independence, its sovereignty. The opposition leader, after the previous elections, he came out to the square, he raised his hands to the sky, and he said, well, in the face of God, I believe myself to be the president. Isn't this ridiculous? And we discussed this situation back then with the U.S. authorities. They supported the opposition back then, and they still support the opposition. So, but they laughed about this, and that was it. But what is this? Any person could come out on a square and say that they are a Pope of Rome. But that's not the way to go. There are certain procedures. You have to be a part of the presidential elections. If you win, then you're a president. Maduro won the elections. He formed a government, and we would like to wish him every success in ruling over the Venezuelan people. And we believe that Brazil and Venezuela, during the various conversations, they will find certain solution. I know that President Lula is an honest person. And from this standpoint, from objective standpoint, he will treat this situation, he will approach this situation. And he asked me to pass certain words to the President of Venezuela during our phone conversation. So my hope is that the situation would be fixed. As for admitting Venezuela or any other country, for this matter, to admit any country to BRICS is only possible if there is a consensus, because we have this rule which states that to admit any candidate as a member of the organization of the BRICS Association, we need a consent from all the member states of BRICS, because otherwise it will be impossible to make this step. Thank you very much. Please don't be mad at me, because my counterparts are waiting for me for the bilateral meetings, and I have a very difficult choice to make, to speak to you or to meet with them. So please don't be mad at me. Thank you very much.